Hello everyone, welcome to The Attic. My name's Mark Jago. I'm a philosophy professor in the UK. Today we're continuing with our Philosophy Glossary, trying to make sense of all that really quite complicated jargon and lingo that we use in philosophy. It can be really difficult to get your heads around this, particularly when you're starting out as a philosophy student, so let's try and make some sense of it. Today we're going to be talking about some tricky concepts that often get people confused. We're going to be talking about necessary and sufficient conditions. So first of all, I'm just going to explain what these things are, and then I'm going to talk you through why they might or may not be important in philosophy. But you can be pretty sure that you're going to meet these terms at some point, so it's good to be able to understand what they mean. Okay, so when we're talking about necessary and sufficient conditions, we're talking in the context of trying to analyze some concept. So let's just take a concept like being married. Suppose we're trying to analyze the concept of being married. We might be talking about necessary or sufficient conditions for being married. What does that mean? Well, a necessary condition for being married is one that you need in order to be married. Okay, so in order to be married, you need to have that necessary condition. So an example would be being a human being. You can't be married unless you're a human being. Another example would be being alive. You can't be married unless you're alive. Okay, so these are necessary conditions for being married. But they're not sufficient. They are insufficient. Because you can have these things and still not be married, right? You can be a human being, you can be alive, you can have a whole bunch of necessary conditions for being married and still not be married. Okay, so being alive, being a human being, these are necessary, but they're not sufficient for being married. What's a sufficient condition for being married? Well, maybe this is a bit of a silly example, but being married to me. Okay, if you're married to me, like my other half is, then it follows that you're married. Okay, kind of automatically. So that is a sufficient condition for being married to me. It's clearly not a necessary condition. You don't have to be married to me to be married. I mean, that would be, life would be very, very complicated if that was the case. So, you have to be married to somebody, but it doesn't have to be me. Okay, so you don't have to have this sufficient condition in order to be married. But if you've got it, like my other half does, then it follows that you're married. Okay, so we might put it a bit more officially like this. A necessary condition for being married is one that being married entails that you have that condition. And a sufficient condition for being married is one where having that condition entails that you're married. And that goes for anything, right? There's nothing specific about being married. If we're talking about a necessary condition for some concept or a sufficient condition for some concept, then a necessary condition for the concept means if you have that concept, then you have the necessary condition. And a sufficient condition means if you have the condition, then you fall under that concept. Okay, why would anybody care about all this stuff? Why does it keep coming up so much when you're studying philosophy? So this has got to do with this idea that part of what we do in doing philosophy is analysing concepts. The idea is we analyse a concept, we kind of pull it apart in order to help us understand it a bit better. And one way in which you might go about doing that, trying to understand a concept by pulling it apart, is by coming up with necessary and sufficient conditions for it. So if you're trying to understand what knowledge is, what justice is, or anything like that, you might say, okay, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, for knowing something? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for an act to count as a just act? Okay, and you might try and come up with those conditions. Now, as it turns out, it's really, really hard to do that for pretty much any interesting, big philosophical concept like justice, truth, existence, knowledge, causation, whatever, right? No one's been all that successful in coming up with necessary and sufficient conditions. So probably it turns out that philosophy, by and large, isn't just or mostly or largely about coming up with necessary and sufficient conditions for concepts. We do loads of other stuff in philosophy, and we understand concepts quite well, and we can analyse concepts quite well without being able to give kind of perfect necessary and sufficient conditions for them. Okay, that's kind of how philosophy goes. Nevertheless, if you're studying philosophy at A-level, at high school, at degree level, you're going to have to understand what these notions, what this terminology of necessary and sufficient conditions means. Okay, you're going to be able to need to use these concepts. And if you want to kind of show off some of your skills in your essay writing, if you're kind of discussing some analysis of knowledge or whatever, and you say something like, this notion of belief, well, it's a necessary but insufficient condition for knowledge, you're really showing off that you've mastered one way of doing philosophy. You've mastered that terminology. That's a good kind of thing to put in your essays. Okay, so I hope you found this video useful. If you have, do me a favour, give it a thumbs up. That really helps me out. I'm going to be doing plenty more of this kind of explaining the terminology, philosophy glossary stuff on the channel. So if you want to see more of that, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to get notifications. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you back here soon.